All right, here to help us break down everything that's been happening in Syria, all the latest news and information. Reuters Pentagon correspondent, our buddy Idrees Ali. Idrees, Mike, and Nick, good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Idrees, I purposely, because I texted you when this all went down and the Syrian president fled to Russia. I texted you. I was like, hey, we'd love to have you come on and explain this. And purposefully, even though I've been following the news about this, I knew nobody would be better to help explain everything that's been happening in this region than you. I know you've been covering this, and I want to get into your takes too later on about the potential incoming Secretary of Defense and the Pentagon and some of your beat with the Trump administration. But at a high level for our audience, can you kind of just explain what has been happening over the last, it feels like maybe 3 or 4 days of information crammed in. I think it's spread out over a couple of weeks, but what has happened in Syria?
So let me take you back even further, more than 10 years ago when the Arab Spring took place in the Middle East. You saw, a bunch of regimes, governments, authoritarian governments fall. And one of the countries where rebellion started was Syria. In 2011, there was a pretty robust uprising in much of the country. But unlike places like Egypt and others, it never was really able to take over the capital, which in this case was Damascus, right? So you had a rebellion. There were, medium-sized pockets where government fell, like Idlib in Syria, and was, controlled by rebels. But we saw countries like Russia coming to the support of President Bashar Al-Assad, and essentially, for the past, really, was it now 13 years, being able to hold on to the country and then push back the rebels. But about 12 days ago, this really interesting thing happened, and it's sort of unclear why it started when it did. But a rebel group known as HTS, which, I'm sure we'll talk about, it has gone through a couple of different iterations, started a new offensive. And, there have been periodic attempts to take territory. So initially, I think a lot of people were sort of looking at it through the lens of other sort of offensives, which is, they'll make a push and it'll be pushed back and things will go back to where they were. But instead, what happened is one of the largest cities in Syria, Aleppo, fell to the rebels. And that raised a lot of eyebrows and sort of like, well, this could be interesting. And then we saw another city fall and then another city fall. So Homs and Hama both fell. And then that brings us to what was really Friday. And this rebel group was, just tens of kilometers away from the capital city of Damascus. And by the weekend, Bashar al-Assad, the president, had fled to Russia. This rebel group had taken over. And essentially, the rebellion that started in 2011 was now complete, just 13 years later. And so we saw in the span of 12 days, a fall of a country that really for the past 13 years had held on to a similar rebellion.
What do you, in your mind, what do you think has led to this recent charge and really the success of the rebels now? As you mentioned, it's been 13 years since the Assad regime has held strong. Has there been any shifts in the country from a policy standpoint, Assad potentially falling back and being less sort of nationally prominent, that both motivated the rebels and potentially set the stage for a successful, what could best be considered an overthrow at this point?
Yeah, so there are two reasons, and I'll come to the more important one last. And the first reason I sort of mentioned is there were countries like Russia and Iran that were really backing Assad, for the past 13 years, essentially, with firepower, money, funding. What we've seen, and we've talked about this in other episodes of yours, is, countries like Russia being bogged down in Ukraine, right? So they have fighters, aircraft, funds that could have been used potentially in Syria that are now tied up in Ukraine. Iran has been, hit by Israel and also hit back, but been engaged in this sort of tit for tat, high stakes situation with Israel over the past few months. So their focus has been broken, and another proxy group, Hezbollah, has also been affected. And so these two main backers of Assad were really on the back foot in the past few months, and there was this opportunity that I think the rebels saw. and then the other reason, which I think is maybe just as important, is sort of the momentum of a rebellion that doesn't always make sense. And this, I sort of go back to 2021 when Afghanistan happened. And I know we talked about it then, and the Taliban sort of started an offensive in Afghanistan, which people, again, at the time were sort of looking at. And then within, a matter of week or weeks, they had taken over the whole country. And reason for that, in that case, was the Afghan army sort of, melted away. And we saw a really similar situation. There wasn't major sort of colossal losses suffered because the Syrian army just sort of melted away. And part of that is explained by, more than a decade of fighting, poor management, lack of funding, a real resource strain, but also a rebellion has a momentum of its own, where if all you're hearing is how the rebels are taking city after city, psychologically that plays a big role in it. And by the end of it, we're seeing pictures on TV, on social media, of soldiers taking off their uniforms and literally running away. And so I think there's a mystique of a rebellion that also played a role in this.
Idrees, you kind of alluded to it a second ago. Nick loves to ask this question about moment of literacy. So I want to jump in on it because obviously we have a conflict that's happening, just southwest, I believe, with Lebanon and Hezbollah. You have Israel, that's obviously has parts of Syria as well. I'd love for you to get into that as well. But just kind of explain what else is happening in the region and how this kind of causes a little bit of pressure now, especially for the Biden administration and the Trump administration coming in. We've already got fighting that's happening all along that corridor as you go all the way up into Syria. So kind of explain a little bit more too, expanding on what is also happening in the region just to the southwest there.
Yeah, the region's really been, I think it's fair to say, very, very tense since October 7th, really, which kicked a lot of things off, which was, when Hamas attacked Israel. We can sort of go on the reasons into why they attacked, but they attacked Israel. And Israel responded with a full-scale invasion of Gaza. The sort of second order effect of that was pretty, I think, it's an intense level of fighting with Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon, and that sort of erupted into a ground war as well. And so you had these two sort of hotspots, Gaza and Lebanon, engaged with Israel. And then you add to that sort of, the country that backs both of them, more so Hezbollah, Iran. And the Israelis carried out some killings and some targeted attacks that really went to the core of Iran and its leadership. And so Iran attacked Israel. There was a back and forth. And so you saw a situation where Israel was essentially engaged with in Gaza, in Lebanon, and sporadically with Iran itself. And so the whole region really was at this really inflection point, really. And it was, Syria, there were a couple of attacks here and there against Israel, but it really wasn't as much a factor in this situation as the other countries I mentioned. And so it was kind of it was bizarre to see such a sort of fractious country sort of chugging along while there was chaos all around it. That was until 12 days ago. And so now you've got a situation, if you're Israel, you've got a ceasefire with Hezbollah and Lebanon, but it's still a tense situation. Israel's still engaged with the remnants of Hamas in Gaza. And now you've got a situation where its border along with Syria, in its opinion, or its view, is now sort of this uncontrolled region, which, could potentially, in their minds, be used to attack Israel. And in recent days, actually in the past 24 hours, we've seen Israel conduct strikes against the remnants of Syria's naval assets, so like Navy ships and missiles. And they've also sent troops into Syria, into parts that were sort of this demilitarized zone in the Golan Heights. They've gone a bit further actually as well. They just say it's a temporary measure. So, the whole region is really an interesting situation, and it really kicked off, a bit over a year ago.
Feeds perfectly into this follow up because I was watching earlier today the lead with Jake Tapper, and Senator Chris Murphy was on the show, who sits on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I know he said something about this region because, and we're going to get into a second. First, Biden administration response, and then the incoming Trump administration, which he's already been active on Truth Social talking about this conflict. But I want to play what Senator Murphy said on Jake Tapper's show. I want to get you to respond. So take a listen to this.
What are your biggest concerns as you watch this all play out?
Well, there's a long list of concerns, but the United States and Israel share some major concerns that as chaos reigns inside Syria, some very dangerous people could get their hands on some very dangerous weapons, including chemical weapons. And so it is in our interest to either destroy or guarantee the security of those weapons of mass destruction before they either get into the hands of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or perhaps this new coalition government about whom the jury is very much still out. This new group of rebels in charge of the capital obviously has long-standing ties to Al-Qaeda and to other extremist groups. We are ready to take them at their word that they have reformed and they are ready to build an inclusive government that protects everyone in Syria, but you have to prepare for the worst, and that's in part what these strikes are designed to do.
So, Idrees, I heard a buzz phrase there that just kind of set off alarm bells. Well, I'm sure you all did as well. Weapons of mass destruction. We heard that once upon a time. Just to an outside observer watching this play out, I heard a lot of concern there from the senator about weapons falling in the wrong hands and not really the people of Syria that have now are now under this oppressive regime. Did you hear a little bit of that as well? What have you been hearing in the DC circles about not only what Senator Murphy just reflected there, but about this conflict overall? Because, the incoming administration with President-elect Trump ran on no new wars. We're not going to get involved in anything. And now we have something else that's happening. And here's a sitting member of the Senate saying, well, we got to get involved just to make sure we make sure everything is safe over there. How does that dichotomy supposed to play out for somebody that's listening to this that go, I thought we weren't going to get involved in any of these type of conflicts anymore?
Yeah, so look, it's a very interesting situation, right? Syria, according to the United States, other governments, expert organizations, has been suspected of using chemical weapons against its own people going back to 2013. And then even in 2017, which at the time, if you remember, President Donald Trump's administration actually responded to with an airstrike or a series of airstrikes. And so the use of chemical weapons or the availability of chemical weapons in Syria, I think is something that many experts agree is the case. It's obviously very dangerous. But the United States and the current administration feels that they are confident that they have a pretty good accountability of where the weapons are and can help get rid of it. The one thing we've heard from U.S. officials is they don't want to send U.S. troops specifically in to deal with the chemical weapons, and they hoping that they can just simply be handed over or be taken out or destroyed by other sort of non-military means. So that's sort of the chemical weapons aspect of it. I think it's important to remember, and I should have said this at the beginning, that there actually are 900 U.S. troops currently in Syria that are sort of in the northeast of the country and really focus on the Islamic State threat. They will occasionally be attacked by Iranian-backed militias and they'll respond, but they're there for the defined purpose of Islamic State and fighting that. So there is a U.S. presence, U.S. military presence in Syria. And I think this is going to bring more of a light about what they're doing and what their future is. Because the Trump administration, twice, President Trump himself tried to remove U.S. troops from Syria, but in his opinion, in the opinion of his advisors, was slow-walked by the Pentagon. And, there were initially 2,000, so they were able to bring them down to 900 and never really left. And so I think the chemical weapons aside, I think there's going to be a big debate in Washington when the Trump administration comes in about what to do with those troops and what the mission is. Because you're right, there is, near zero appetite, even within this administration, to send U.S. troops into Syria to get, really, I think a lot of experts would say, get bogged down in internal strife in a really complicated situation. And I think, I think there's a desire, not just from the Trump administration, but even from Biden in his last, 30 odd days, not to get involved in Syria militarily. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the next few days.
What are you most curious about with the rebels now taking Syria? Do you have any sense of what their political ideology is? When I say region in the Middle East in general, what leaders should be mindful of with this new organization, regime, call it what you want, that's now stepping into power?
So this group known as HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is not really a new organization. It's actually been on the scene for quite a while. And just to give a bit of background, the leader of this group, Jalani, was a Saudi-born Syrian, and he fought against the Americans during the 2003 invasion. And in, I think it was 2005, he was arrested by the Americans and put in a camp. And that's where he met Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would then become the leader of ISIS. And so his time in U.S. sort of not prison, but U.S. detention in Iraq was really spent learning the ways of people like Baghdadi. And in 2011, he was dispatched to Syria to start a group which was really linked to Al-Qaeda. And it's that group that has evolved into HTS. And so that's the origins, right? This sort of militant group that is now, I don't want to say reformed, but it's definitely made efforts in the past few months and years to transform itself from this militant organization into a more, not really secular, but more sort of mainstream. It's interesting. You'll see the leader, Jalani, in older videos, dressed in maybe what would be considered more Islamic garb. But these days he's dressed in more of a traditional sort of military, more Zelensky type clothes. And so there's been a real effort by him and his organization to really come across as not the militant organization it once used to be, but more open to working with not just Sunni Muslims, but the different groups within Syria. One of the edicts that they first sent out when they took power was that no one would tell women in Syria what to wear, for example, right? So there's this real effort to come across as being a group that, the outside world can work with. It is also important to remember that this group is a United Nations and United States designated terror organization. And so it's I don't want to say contradictory, but it's a situation where this group is clearly aware of some of the issues other countries, including only in the West, have with them. They're trying to come across as dealing with it. And I think what we have to wait and see is this genuine change, or is this just change for the sake of now being in power, saying the right things, but reverting back? Because we've seen many organizations that have taken power throughout the world that say the right things, but then in a few months, will go back to sort of their old ways. The Taliban, when they took over Afghanistan most recently, said, no problem, women can go to school, no issues. That hasn't started for women in Afghanistan. So I think there's hope, but there's a lot of skepticism as well about this group and what it might mean for Syria.
It's a great point about Afghanistan there and what the Taliban promised and what they haven't delivered on. I did want to pivot to somebody who promised something and is now potentially delivering on it, and it affects your world and the coverage, because we were talking about this off air about covering the Trump administration. Now that we actually know that President-elect Trump is coming back into office, he's obviously made some controversial picks out there in the DC circuit, especially the one that is affecting a department that you cover in the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense with Pete Hegseth. I would love to get first your takes on first the overall pick, but mainly the pick and how it affects foreign policy, the conflicts like this, the handling of the military and the defense spending, and what we're going to do about conflicts like this. It's going to be a change potentially in what the Trump administration is going to do. So kind of a two-parter there. What did you make of when you heard Pete Hegseth getting picked for this role? And now what do you make of him potentially stepping into all these conflicts that we've already outlined that are happening in that part of the world?
When his name was first announced, it was through a statement around like 7 p.m. on a weeknight. And I think the impression or the reaction to a lot of sources I had at the Pentagon was like, who is this? And I think there's just a lot of confusion and just eyebrow raising about who this person was. And, you then spend time reading his books, watching his interviews, and you get a sense of sort of who the person is. But the initial reaction was from a lot of people in Washington, including at the Pentagon, who is this guy? Because he was not on anyone's radar. Sort of a Fox News host who has received 2 Bronze Stars, but was at a relatively junior level when you compare it to the defense secretary. I sort of mentioned, reading his books is actually a great way to sort of get to know his understanding and his thinking on things, because he's laid them out pretty clearly. He's expanded on them since being nominated, but there are 2 parts to this. The first part is what it means for foreign wars, foreign conflicts, and sort of U.S. foreign policy. And the one thing I've noticed, and it struck me, is sort of, and this is in line with Trump's thinking, is that he doesn't want the U.S. engaged in unnecessary wars, as many Republicans put it. So, you might see some engagements here and there on the global stage vis-a-vis the military, but the hope, and I think his desire, is for the military not to be engaged in many conflicts outside the United States. So that's what it might mean. Trump has come out on Truth Social actually talking about Syria, and I think in all caps he said the U.S. should not get involved. And so I think that's a hint at what it might mean if when Trump comes into power, if things like this happen. I think the initial sort of reaction from the administration might be, let's not get involved unless we absolutely have to. So that's the first part. Second part is what it means for the military, and I think that's where a lot of the focus is going to be for Hegseth if he is confirmed. And he's taken jabs at some of the most senior military officials in the Pentagon. He's hinted at firing them. He has made comments about how women should not serve in combat. And he's really gone after what he calls woke policies at the Pentagon. And so I think we're going to see, pretty concerted effort by Hegseth and the people who come with him at sort of turning the military into sort of a Pentagon that might not be as inclusive, whether it's for women or transgender troops or minorities, and in their view, focusing on warfighting. But I think what a lot of people will see as being, shunning away people who aren't male or white from the military. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how he's able to sort of deliver on these sort of edicts that he's laid out in so many books and podcasts over the past few years.
Idrees, before we let you go, and this is more on a personal front because we were talking about this off air, I want to bring it over here about the covering of an administration like the Biden and the outgoing one versus a Trump administration. For you as a reporter, and we've had so many different strategists on or people that cover these different departments and these leaders, what are some of the things that you're looking for in 2025, specifically from the Pentagon and other departments out there in D.C., in terms of what the Trump administration is going to do and the promises that they ran on versus keeping those promises? Because as somebody in the media, you get, fortunate enough to ask a lot of these questions. So what are some of the stories that you feel like are going to be hyper-focused from your lens and what you're covering for 2025 that you think the Trump administration maybe will handle differently than the Biden administration, whether it be good or bad or indifferent?
The one thing I learned, and I was doing some introspection from covering the first Trump administration, was don't dismiss what Trump says. I think in the first administration, there was a tendency, probably out of inexperience. When Trump said something, I think there would be a lot of sort of shrugging shoulders and, sighing and sort of moving on. But I think he has showed in his first administration and intent in the second administration to do what he says. Now, he could be walked back, he could be slow walked, but I think his intention is very much to do what he says or tweets or puts on Truth Social. I think what's going to be different, and what I'm looking at, is he is surrounding himself with men and women in the cabinet who will actually do what he's saying, rather than, as I think he perceived, people slowing down his agenda in the first administration. And so I think there are a couple of things that will really be in focus, at least from the Pentagon side and the U.S. military side. First one is sort of what we discussed right before this, and that's internal U.S. military. What does the U.S. military look like? Do women continue serving in combat? What does it mean for transgender troops? and what happens with the senior most levels of the Pentagon. There's a bunch of reporting out there about how the Trump administration or transition team has already come up with a list of people they want to remove when they join, when they come into power on Jan 20th. Second thing is sort of the ability of the Pentagon and the military to do things that traditionally they would not have been doing, and that are really going to be considered really controversial. And the first thing that comes to mind, and the main thing, is immigration and migrants. Trump has talked about using the military to deport what he calls our illegal migrants. The U.S. military has a long history of not getting involved in that. But if that becomes a key central part of what the military does, I think it's going to reshape how the U.S. potentially sees its own military. And so those two things are the big things I'm looking when it comes to the Trump administration internally. Externally, I think the big thing is China. How does the Trump administration put what I assume is going to be a bigger budget for the military towards building up its forces in Asia, buying new and improved weapon systems? And how much pressure is this administration going to put on China when it comes to Taiwan? Because U.S. officials have said that the Chinese president wants his military to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. Doesn't mean he is, but he wants the military to be ready. So that comes within sort of Trump's second term, right? 2027. And so is he able to push China back, or is he going to give in? So those are the things that I'm really looking at from my perch.
Idrees Ali, you can check out all of his work over at Reuters.com. Go follow him on Twitter. I'll never call it X. We're going to call it Twitter. He's got tons of followers there. He puts out all the latest information, all his articles as well. Idrees, you do great work, man. Continued success to you. Happy New Year if we don't talk to you. Stay safe, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.